I want to spend a couple of moments with you and explain to you something that's going on in churches around the country, particularly evangelical churches. There is a great debate now over critical theory, particularly CRT, critical race theory. Critical theory is a Marxist-derived philosophy that is started in a lot of law schools. And there are some people, like, for example, David French at the Dispatch, who say you can derive some merit from critical theory. I am in the camp that we should not be using Marxist philosophical thought to explain anything in the United States. Those who essentially embrace critical theory believe that critical theory allows us to see the world through the lens of power and power imbalances. One of the things with critical theory is, for example, how communists argue that we've never done communism right. Well, people who embrace critical theory essentially say that unless you're well studied in it and have degrees in it, you can't really explain it. You're not an authority on it. So, for example, Tim Keller is an advocate of racial reconciliation within evangelical churches. But Tim Keller is an opponent of critical theory. And he's being attacked by conservatives for saying he is a critical theorist, even though he's written highly critically of it, denouncing it, and it gets attacked by people who embrace it. While the critical theorists say Tim Keller can't actually talk about the Bible because he's a white man and the Bible wasn't written by white men. Keller actually provides the greatest explanation for critical theory I have found out there. I want to read you some of it. Drawing on the teachings of Karl Marx, what can be called postmodern critical theory has emerged very recently with an account of justice different from all the others. Critical theory argues that the explanation for all unequal outcomes in wealth, well-being, and power is never due to individual actions or to differences in cultures or to differences in human abilities, but only and strictly due to unjust social structures and systems. Second, all art, religion, philosophy, morality, law, media, politics, education, and forms of the family are determined not by reason or truth, but by social forces. Everything is determined by your class consciousness and social location. Religious doctrine, together with all politics and law, are always at bottom a way for people to get or maintain social status, wealth, and therefore power. Third, therefore, reality is nothing but power. And if that is the case, then to see reality, power must be mapped through the means of intersectionality: race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. If you're white, male, straight, cisgender, then you have the highest amount of power. If you're none of these, you're the most marginalized and oppressed. Only powerlessness and oppression bring moral high ground and true knowledge. The way power is exercised is through language, through so-called dominant discourses. A dominant discourse is any truth claim, whether grounded in supposed reason and science or in religion and morality. Language does not merely describe reality, it constructs it. Cultures, like people, can be mapped through intersectionality. In one sense, no culture is better in any regard than any other culture. All cultures are equal and valid, but people who see their culture as better and judge other cultures as inferior, even people who see their own culture as normal and judge others as exotic, are members of an oppressive culture. Neither individual rights nor individual identity are primary. Traditional liberal emphasis on individual human rights is an obstacle to radical change. That's essentially critical theory. Now, people who are critical theorists have criticized Tim Keller for accurately describing critical theory because he points out deeply incoherent issues within critical theory they don't think are deeply incoherent. For example, he writes, if all truth claims and justice agendas are socially constructed to maintain power, then why aren't the claims and agendas of the adherents of this view subject to the same critique? It's a fair question, and they don't like you asking it. There's a situation within a lot of evangelical churches now where some people within the churches have embraced critical theory, and other people within churches are screaming about critical theory as a way to never have to address race-based sin within churches. If we're all sinners and racism is a sin, then certainly racism can invade churches. It is possible. And I'm in the camp that thinks that churches need to address the issue. I'm also in the camp that thinks critical theory is not the way to address the issue, because critical theory cannot actually reflect Scripture, where there's absolute truth and there is absolute grace. and there's absolute forgiveness, and Scripture is colorblind. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither male nor female. Critical theory requires us to see those things. When you hear pastors and others say we must be conscious of race and must be conscious of class, they're pulling from critical theory. When you hear politicians say we can't be a colorblind society anymore, not only are they rejecting Martin Luther King, they're embracing critical theory. I have a real hard time with the people in churches these days whenever the issue of racial reconciliation comes up, say, oh, that's critical theory. We can't discuss this. No, we got to move on, when there are real problems. And they're just screaming about critical theory to avoid engaging the issue. But I got a big problem with people who try to grab hold of critical theory and run with it and say, this is what we have to use. This is the tool. This explains everything. Using worldly tools that are derived from Marxism, a philosophy that is completely antithetical to faith of any kind, except in the state, is not wise for churches to dabble in. And frankly, when you listen to and take seriously the proponents of critical theory, what they essentially argue is that unless you are a critical theorist, you can't understand it. And that allows them pervasive control of the conversation, when the conversation, if you understand what critical theory is about, if you understand it at all, what they're essentially saying is that there can be no grace, there can be no common ground, because it's always about power imbalances. Now, what they want is for themselves to get power, and then they can shut down the conversation, because remember, one of the issues with critical theory is it's all about language, dominant discourse. This is why you have so many people on the left these days screaming about free speech, that free speech is no longer valued. It's because of critical theory. You've got, for example, a movement within some evangelical churches for racial reparations, that the government should go with racial reparations, that it is just, and they mask it in biblical language, and then dare to denounce anyone who criticizes them as being polluted by the dominant discourses that must be broken down, or filled with racism, or unwanting to let go of their own power. By you not wanting your hard-earned money to be redistributed to someone who doesn't have it makes you a bad person in critical theory. We're seeing this in some churches, some evangelical churches, some churches within my own denomination, the PCA, are embracing this nonsense. Fact of the matter is, there are problems in and out of churches regarding race in this country for historic reasons. But trying to embrace a Marxist philosophy to untangle it and deal with it causes more harm than good, particularly when the practitioners of it tell everyone who doesn't practice it, well, you don't really understand it, you're not allowed to deploy it. And when they deploy it, part of what it is they've got to silence anyone who dares speak up against them.